Good morning. I'm going to start with Franz Kafka's famous short story, The Metamorphosis, about Gregor Samsa turning into a giant insect. I have a few pictures of Kafka up here at the top as a child, as a young man, and then as an adult writer. This is a picture of Kafka's grave. The doctor, by the way, in the tombstone comes from the fact that he was a lawyer, and that is a Doctor of Laws degree. There are a lot of parodies of the Metamorphosis, and you'll see one of those, a cartoon version of it, on our Blackboard site. So I put a cartoon here at the bottom as well. Here's a little bit about Kafka. He was Jewish, he was German speaking, but born and raised and lived most of his life in Prague. He wrote his first short story in 1908. The Metamorphosis was a later story, written about 1912 but not published until 1915. His novels, his major novels, and I've read all of them at one time or another, were all published well after his death by his best friend Max Brod. And here is Max Brod. Here he was a lawyer alongside him, and they went to law school together. And here they are at a resort. These are Kafka's parents, and one of the interesting questions is there much of Kafka's parents in Gregor Samsa's parents? Biographical critics have had a field day looking at these kinds of questions. And like so many other things with Kafka, we just simply don't know. Um, Kafka was a successful lawyer. And one of the things that I think we always forget about is we think of him as a writer and a very tortured man, but he was very much a normal human being in many, many ways. Here, I've given you photographs of two of the three women he was engaged, I'm sorry, three women, two of whom he was engaged to. He was engaged to Phyllis Bauer for a couple of years. Here they are together. He was then later engaged to Julie Warzek, who was a hotel maid, in fact, not a very well-educated person. While he was engaged to Felice, he had an affair with one of Felice's friends, Greta Bloch. There's a story that he had a child by her, but there's, from what I've been able to find out, no basis in fact to that. But I put these in here just to point out that um, Kafka had the same kind of sort of dreams and desires in professional life that many people do. He was a very successful attorney. He worked as a risk management person and as a claims evaluator and reviewer for an insurance firm in Prague. So he always thought of his writing as his primary duty and his job as his secondary. And even though he worked up until the day he died, just about until the day he actually had to go into a sanitarium for tuberculosis, he was a productive and active member in his profession, but he was writing all the time. But we don't know quite how much he wrote because he burned about 90% of it before he died. Kafka was also the oldest of six children. He had two brothers who died when they were very young. One as an infant, one as a child. And then he had three sisters, and all three sisters perished in concentration camps during World War II. The metamorphosis begins where we find out that Gregor Samsa is the sole support of his family. His sister, his mother, his father don't work at all. He pays for their apartment. He pays for their servants. He pays for their food. He pays for everything. And which suggests that Samsa is a fairly successful traveling salesman. He's a cloth seller. That's what he appears to sell anyway. And it's only when Samsa turns into a big bug and he can't go out and work anymore that the family suddenly realizes that they have to maintain themselves on their own. And suddenly we find out that the father has stashed away money from a bankruptcy that nobody knew he had, and that's able to sustain them. That and the fact that they all get jobs. His father becomes a bank messenger. His mother begins sewing underwear for rich ladies, and his sister takes a job in a shop. The apartment in the story, which to me expands and contracts as the story goes on, it seems to get bigger and smaller at various times. But other critics have pointed out that it is almost identical to the apartment that Kafka and his family lived in for most of his life. It's an extremely complicated family dynamic. Gregor seems to be the very dutiful son who feels under an obligation to his parents that he really can't shake. He's particularly attached to his sister and her violin playing. We see him almost at the moment before he dies. Gregor wanders out of his room and he's listening to the violin playing that his sister is doing. He wants her earlier in the story to send her to conservatory and make her a famous violinist. But unfortunately, he turns into a bug and he's not able to do that. If you're baffled by this story, you're in good company. Everybody is baffled by this story. Nobody really knows exactly what it means. And so the 100 years or so that it's been around, critics, writers have been looking at it in a variety of different ways. Um, Some people look at this as an allegory, and I've got an article posted to Blackboard that talks about that. If you get interested in that, allegories traditionally are ones where the characters embody one particular virtue or one particular vice, pure evil, pure good, virtue, dissembling, dishonesty. And in ancient times, they would have actually carried those names with them in an allegory. In our particular story, we have to look on these characters as having certain characteristics that seem to dominate them. Gregor seems to be an extraordinarily dutiful son. His father seems like a mooch to me. His mother seems to be conflicted when Gregor turns into a bug about, is this really my son and I should be a mother, or am I horrified by the fact that I have this 5 or 4 foot insect living in my house? And his sister starts off on Gregor's side, and then over time kind of switches. At one point, she finally says, we just have to get used to the fact that there's not really Gregor in there anymore. It's something else. And then she can begin to deal with it like it's just a real bug. There are some translation questions, and at one point, at the beginning of the story, the word insect is used in the translation that we have. The charwoman later in the story calls him a dung beetle. Other translators have used other words. Is it bug? Is it cockroach? Is it vermin? For that famous first sentence. And the German word, which escapes me just now, has a variety of different meanings. I wouldn't get too hung up on that. Well, what exactly kind of bug is he? But he just accepts the fact that he's an insect and that he's pretty good sized. But the translation might get in the way sometimes in terms of what exactly we're seeing in the story. Here are some things to think about. One of the first things we're drawn to in the story is that Gregor is cut before he turns into an insect, a photograph or an image of a woman with a muff, a fur muff, from a magazine, and he's framed it and he's put it on a wall. This was a fairly common thing for people to do in the 19th century. So it's not really weird, kind of the way that we might hang a poster up, or we might get an image from online and blow it up and hang it on our wall. But what exactly she's doing in there, I don't know. It becomes a huge point later in the story when the mother and the sister are trying to clean his room and they want to get rid of the picture. Something else to think about is his family changes over time as the story goes on. And so you wonder, who's the true family? Is it the family we see in the beginning? Is it the family we see at the end? Or does his family not really change at all? And they're confronted, like all of us would be, with an extraordinarily complicated event, living with this very large insect and trying to figure out what to do with it. A third point, something I hadn't noticed till I'd read it a couple of times, is the story begins at Christmas time, very much like The Dead and some other stories that we've looked at, where Christmas is kind of a big deal in fiction. It's always an interesting touch point, this idea of some birth of some savior. Well, here it's almost like a mirror image of that, where the bug, in fact, causes his family to fall apart, sort of. Something you might want to think about, item number 4 here, is the idea of, well, how do we respond to insects? And what if Gregor were a different animal? Why an insect? Why, of all the things that he could have been turned into, why is he a bug? Something else that we see in here is the idea of Gregor as a human kind of dissembles or dissipates as the story goes on. He becomes more insect-like. He can't be understood. He can't figure out what to eat. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that happen to him in here. And so you always wonder, how much of an insect is he really? Is he an insect on the outside and a human on the inside? Because we're always inside his head. We're always inside his consciousness. And we keep wondering, I think, just how much of a real insect he is. He seems to have insect-like habits. He moves like an insect, but he doesn't seem to think like one. And so one of the questions you might want to ask yourself is, how do we fully recognize another human being, and how do we quantify or measure their humanity? How do we decide what's worthy of being treated in the way that we treat human beings? How do we make those divisions? We have some weird groups in here too. We have the servants, we have a cook, we have a cleaning maid, and they disappear. And we have this charwoman who's just a cleaning lady. That's all a charwoman means. And so she comes in by the day, works for a few hours, and goes away. And she's the one who finally disposes of Gregor's body after he dies. And that may be a significant question as well. We also have the 3 lodgers that at some point in the story, the family decided it needs to make more money, so it rents out a room, and it rents it to these 3 men, one of whom appears to be in charge. All they do is seem to bitch and sit around smoking and reading a paper. At the same time, they're greatly deferred to by Gregor's family. They're not quite sure what to do with these guys, so they treat them very deferentially. It's not as if they're equals. It's as somehow the Lodgers are better than the Samsa family. And the last point that I want to make here is that many critics have compared Gregor Samsa, sole support of his family, always cheerful, never really questions things, to being kind of like the Old Testament figure of Job. That is a man who was being tested by God to determine the limits of his faith. Well, Job is rewarded at the end of that story, but that's certainly not what happens to Gregor. So there's plenty to think about. I don't want to tell you anything more about my particular perspective on it because I don't want to interfere with how you're going to respond to the discussion board postings. So I'm looking very much forward to what you have to say on that. Thank you very much.